So is Buddhism pessimistic? It's often seen that way, and we'll discuss it coming right up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled life, consider subscribing to the channel. So is Buddhism pessimistic? I think this is something that we often hear from people who are not very familiar with Buddhism, who may have heard bits and pieces here and there. It sometimes is a criticism of Buddhism by people from other belief systems. And even, I think, some people within Buddhism may have that feeling from time to time, depending on how the material is being presented. And the question is, why? Where would that come from? What's the reason for this? And I'll go into that. But the way to begin is the First Noble Truth. And the First Noble Truth is, and I'll link to the video. I have a video on an introduction to the Four Noble Truths in case that's new to you. But the First Noble Truth is the noble truth of what in Pali is called dukkha, which is a very difficult word to translate, but literally means something like pain. More figuratively, more accurately, means something more like unsatisfactoriness, or some people translate it as stress. I think unsatisfactoriness is probably the best translation we could use, in the sense that life is not completely satisfactory to us in very many respects. And in the Buddha's supposed first sermon, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the Buddha he sort of defines, if you like, dukkha. He says that it's the truth that birth is suffering, that aging is suffering, that illness is suffering, that death is suffering. And again, all these can be translated as unsatisfactory. Union with what is displeasing is suffering. Separation from what is pleasing is suffering. Not to get what one wants is suffering. In brief, the five aggregates subject to clinging are suffering or are unsatisfactory. Now again, I've used the word suffering here. One could just as easily use the word unsatisfactory in all those cases. But we can see the scope of the problem here. And we'll leave aside the last one having to do with the five aggregates. Basically what he means is the whole human body and mind and the world around us are all infused with this kind of unsatisfactory nature. And certainly one can say that sounds pretty pessimistic. And there's a very good video out by the Professor David Webster that deals with this issue of whether Buddhism is pessimistic. And David Webster talks about the Buddha's Four Noble Truths in terms of a kind of medical model, which I think is quite accurate and quite apt. So the First Noble Truth is basically noticing the illness that we have. And then we have the diagnosis of what that illness is due to. And the Second Noble Truth, the Third Noble Truth, is that there is a possible antidote to this illness. And then the Fourth Noble Truth is what that antidote is, the path. So if we see it that way, then it becomes less pessimistic, because the First Noble Truth of suffering is seen in the scope of the entire theory, if you like. And there's obviously optimism to be had, because there's a way out of this. But I think this kind of response is not going to be immediately convincing to many of us. For many of us, we're going to say, look, I mean, life is good. We got blue sky. I don't have blue sky now. It's raining here, or lightly raining anyway. But, we have blue sky in our lives. The birds are singing. It's a beautiful day. We have great friends. We have a close family. We have lots of people that we love. Now, what's not to like? And to that respect, a kind of a focus on the unsatisfactory nature of life may seem a turnoff. It may seem even silly. It may seem the sort of thing where you just say, look, get a hobby, take a walk, do something else for a while, and that kind of feeling of unsatisfactoriness will leave you. Also, and more deeply, there is this kind of idea in our culture that accepting this kind of unsatisfactory nature, this kind of suffering, can seem weak. That it can seem like only the weak people suffer, that the strong people, the successful people, they're happy. And so if we accept suffering, that's almost like to accept our own weakness, and to accept ourselves as being unsuccessful. And that if we could only see ourselves as successful, or if we only were successful, we wouldn't be in that place. But I would argue that this is, I would say, a classic case of spiritual bypassing. Now, I've done an earlier video on spiritual bypassing, which I'll put up on the screen here if you haven't seen it, if you don't know what that phrase means. Very roughly, what it means is that we can see ourselves as more advanced than we really are. We see parts of ourselves that we don't like, parts of the world or ourselves that we turn away from, And so, in a sense, we bypass them. We pretend that they don't exist. We distract ourselves when it comes to looking at them deeply. And as a result, we can fool ourselves into thinking that we're without problems, when in fact the problems are right there, but we're just not willing or psychologically able to look at them. And in particular, I would say we in the West are often sold this bill of goods that successful people don't suffer, that they don't have their own problems, that they don't have difficult lives as well. And in certain circumstances, they don't have even more difficult lives than people who are perhaps less successful. Because often, to be successful is to sacrifice an awful lot of what most of us would consider absolutely necessary parts of life. And there's a relatively recent video out by Casey Neistat where he talks about one of some of the stresses of being a successful person on YouTube, which struck a chord with me because I'm on YouTube as well. I'm not successful like he is, but his point is that he often finds it difficult to discuss success on YouTube and the problems that come with it, because he doesn't want to seem ungrateful. Because people are going to say, you're living the dream, Casey. You've made success in an arena that many of us are trying to. So, as he says, how dare you complain about it? You can't complain about something that you've got and that we all want. And I'm sure that is a kind of response that Casey does get when he complains. But it's, I think, something that the more psychologically wise, the more wise people who are successful will have to deal with. In other words, people who become successful know that they're lucky. They know that they're indebted towards other people. Even if they don't think of themselves as lucky, they certainly do think of themselves as indebted to their audience, indebted to their patrons, people who've helped them. And so they don't want to seem ungrateful. And as a result, they tend to spiritually bypass. Or if they're not spiritually bypassing, they tend at least to cover up in public their own questions and concerns and problems and issues with being successful. So in other words, oftentimes these successful people will sort of play the role of somebody without problems. And that's how we get sold the bill of goods, is that we accept that, we believe that. And that in fact, some of these successful people are actually not being helpful by playing the role of somebody without problems, without dukkha, without a sense of unsatisfactoriness. There are these wins that come and go. Anybody who's successful has to worry about failure in their next attempt, in their next video, in their next movie. Anybody who's been praised has to be, and who clings to that praise, or clings to the success, anyone who clings to the praise has to be concerned about blame in their next outing. So what I want to drive home here is that everyone experiences dukkha. Everyone experiences what makes life unsatisfactory in these respects, even the most successful among us. And in the case of the most successful among us, there tend to be two strategies. The strategy of spiritual bypassing, of pretending that the stuff doesn't exist, of convincing yourself that it doesn't exist by turning away from it, distracting yourself, or by playing a role, by feeling like because you're indebted to certain aspects of your success to other people, that you shouldn't make them feel bad by letting them know the truth, which is success really isn't all it's cracked up to be. So every one of us has this problem with dukkha, with unsatisfactoriness. But the thing is that we can't come to a solution of that problem until we know that we have the problem, until we know the extent of the problem. Because many of us think, oh, this is something that comes in short bursts, maybe for 5 minutes a day, maybe when we're not distracted. Casey is famous for distracting himself with work literally all the time. So you wonder, how often is he going to be aware of these facts about his own life when he slows down enough for the realities to bubble up? And what the practice of Buddhism do is to help make us aware of these realities, of these absolute realities in our own life, and also of the depth and extent of them. And of course, that's not because the person and people who have constructed this over the years are pessimistic and want us to end there. Of course not. The first is only the first of 4 noble truths. So the point is to get us to be aware of the depth so that we'll then go to practice, to try to overcome these problems, to get out of them in a wiser way than simply bypassing them and pretending that they don't exist. And of course, this problem, just to drive home the point even more, this problem is quite extreme. Let's just look at reality with open eyes, which is we have friends and family that we love dearly. Every one of them is going to die eventually. We have places and houses and possessions that we perhaps love dearly, that we love spending time at. Every one of those is going to decay into nothing with time, is going to change. These things are not going to remain. And of course, even we ourselves will die eventually. No matter what we do, no matter how we try, eventually our life will reach its end. These are truths that we simply cannot escape forever. And so coming to terms with them can actually make our lives wiser and in their own way, kinder and less stressed. Because if we're not as stressed about these deep issues, it's going to make our ability to be kinder towards other people much easier. And of course, none of this is to deny that life can be very good, that life can be pleasant. But every pleasant experience, every good part of life has its arising and its passing. Every good experience is fleeting. Dukkha isn't simply an illusion. It's something that's real. It's something that's part of life. It's something that we have to accept. And then, of course, having said this, we get to the more optimistic part, if you like, the diagnosis that the doctor gives, which is to stop craving things in the world, to stop clinging to things, to stop identifying ourselves with things that change. These are the ways that that through long practice, we can find the dukkha declining slowly over time, that we become more equanimous with the reality of change in the world. We become more equanimous with the reality that all fame is fleeting, that no matter what we do that's pleasant, it's going to come to an end, that everything that we love will have its time span. And that if we can practice this way, we'll get to a place of wisdom. And that is a place of I think, much deeper and stronger and more well-grounded happiness than the kind of superficial, fleeting happiness that we were in when we began this whole process. And to that end, there's a nice chapter of the Dhammapada which talks about happiness. And to read a couple of verses from that chapter, it says, "Ah, so happily we live, without hate among those with hate. Among people who hate, we live without hate. Victory gives birth to hate. The defeated sleep in anguish. Giving up both victory and defeat, those who have attained peace sleep happily." So that's not to say, of course, don't be successful. What it's to say is to give up the kind of rat race striving that leads towards seeing the world in terms of victories over other people, victories over people who are defeated. Because that's the kind of thing that gets us into the problems to begin with, that gets us into the hatred. So is Buddhism pessimistic? No, it's not. Buddhism is realistic. It's not intended to be pessimistic at all. It's intended to be an open-eyed, clear-eyed look at reality, a realistic look. And in fact, taken as a whole, the Noble Truths as a whole, I wouldn't say it's only realistic, I would say it's an optimistic realism. The claim that we can actually come to a complete end of all of this stuff is perhaps even too optimistic for many of us. But even if we can't come to a complete end of all of dukkha, we can certainly go a long way towards alleviating it. And that is the secret, I think, of dedicated long-term practice. So I hope that's been useful to you. If you have any questions or comments about this, I'd really love to hear them. And so please put them down below. I'll read them, and I hope all of you will read them as well and comment or respond to other comments if you like. I always love reading them, and we'll catch you on the next one of these videos. So thanks so much, and be well.